It's easy to think of rebellion as something distant, events that happened long ago in faraway places, but not all revolutions happen on distant battlefields. Some happened right here in the hills of South Fayette, Pennsylvania. In the years following the American Revolution, the people of this land found themselves locked in another struggle, not against a king, but against their own government. This is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion and how one small region changed the authority of the new United States.
By the 1790s, the dust of the American Revolution had begun to settle. The young United States was finally free of British rule, but freedom came with a price. The war had left the nation deeply in debt, as soldiers needed paid, foreign loans needed repaid, and a sense of national stability restored. The new government under President George Washington and his ambitious Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, believed it was time to prove that this fragile republic could sustain itself financially. Hamilton's solution was controversial: an excise tax on distilled spirits. On paper, it was simple: tax the production of whiskey and other alcohol to raise revenue, but the consequences of that policy would ripple far beyond the halls of Congress. To city merchants and the political elite in Philadelphia and New York, the tax made sense. Whiskey was widely consumed. It was, they argued, a luxury, an item people could live without. But in western Pennsylvania, particularly in small farm communities like South Fayette, this wasn't just a bad policy, it was betrayal. Here, whiskey wasn't a luxury, it was a lifestyle. Farmers in South Fayette and surrounding areas faced difficult terrain, limited roads, and long distances to markets. Hauling bulky perishable grain across the Allegheny Mountains to sell in the east was often impossible. But distilling that grain into whiskey, that turned surplus crops into a valuable, compact, and non-perishable product. Whiskey could be stored, traded, and even used as a form of currency. In fact, for many in South Fayette, whiskey was their paycheck. They used it to pay debts, barter for tools and supplies, and support their families. The federal tax struck at the very heart of their local economy. Making matters worse, the tax was structured in a way that favored large-scale eastern distillers over small frontier producers. Larger distilleries could pay a flat annual fee, while smaller backcountry farmers had to pay by the gallon, an impossible burden for people who were already scraping by. So, when federal agents, also seen as strangers from the east, came into the hills demanding records, fees, and compliance, the people of South Fayette didn't see government policy. They saw tyranny. They saw another oppressive tax, this time not from the British Crown, but from a very government that they helped to create. For these royal Americans, the whiskey tax was more than just a financial blow. It was an insult. It questioned their independence, their honor, and their way of life.
So, what made the Whiskey Rebellion such a major test for the new federal government?
All right, it's our new federal government, okay? It's testing a lot of things here. The Constitution isn't that old. People are getting used to it. And to have a tax levied, an unfair tax they figured levied out here was not considered possible under our new Constitution. They thought they were protected here from unfair taxes, and the whiskey tax was totally unfair. So it was a test of our country's ability to levy and collect taxes. These are people who had, mostly Scotch-Irish, who had fought for generations against tyranny and high taxes, came to this country, had to fight a revolutionary war to escape tyranny and high taxes. They thought they were home free, and then they find out that this country is trying to tax their whiskey, which is the only commodity they had to make any kind of money out of all. In effect, it was an income tax to them. So it was a test of the country to do that. It was also a test of the country to enforce its laws under the Constitution. There was a great question for a while whether our country can use an army against its own people. So the way it worked out, they did not have a standing army. They were going to rely on militia to protect the country in case of any crisis. So George did it first. George Washington did something nobody ever done before, and collect militia units from around the country, actually 3 states in the country, to march here, 13,000 troops to march here and put down this rebellion. And he established precedent, and he established a rule of law that allows its country to do this kind of thing, to enforce its laws. So those are two tests on the Constitution. One, that can the country levy and enforce its taxes? And two, can a president actually have the authority to mount an army against his own people, which he has, and he still has, by the way.
Perfect. Why did farmers resist so strongly here?
Okay, I think I touched on some of that there. These are these are frontiersmen to begin with. They're not only fighting Indians, they're fighting all the dangers of the frontier with very little help from our federal government. Actually, no help from our federal government. And they didn't feel their taxes, whatever taxes they paid the federal government, really doing them any good. There were no roads, not much help in settling issues with the Spanish along the Mississippi River, where they could ship their goods. They were the forgotten people, more or less. It wasn't exactly a thing about taxation without representation. They did have representatives who were elected to Congress, but they had very little influence because they represented only a few of the population who were here. And so to have them tax their whiskey was just more than they could really handle. So they picked up their muskets and did something about it.
Significance of the Oliver Miller homestead in the context of the Whiskey Rebellion.
Sure. Miller was actually the first person who is going to be killed as a result of the Whiskey Rebellion. When things kind of boiled over in 1794, and a group of individuals are going to go and start threatening one of the federal tax collectors, Oliver Miller is going to be killed as a result of that. But Oliver Miller's home itself was really one of the major locations of of the distilling industry in this part of the country. Oliver Miller himself was involved in whiskey distilling, as were many people in Western Pennsylvania. And of course, there are several other places, such as Bower Hill in this area, and Braddock's Field, that are also going to be kind of the epicenters of what we know today as the Whiskey Rebellion.
Thank you. And then, living so close to Oliver Miller homestead, what do you think it must have felt like to live there in 1794 during the rebellion? You know,
I think that we have a hard time thinking about this being the frontier, but at one point Pittsburgh was as far west as you could go. And the term we use, civilization ends. Civilization, as you would have known it, would have ended in Pittsburgh, and from that point on it would have been wilderness. It would have been seen as being a territory filled with danger because, of course, Native Americans were living in that area and were largely perceived as being hostile. It's interesting because one of the reasons why so many of people in Western Pennsylvania actually are going to rise up is because they did not view the federal government as really taking their security needs from Native Americans seriously. And so for them, having to pay an excise tax to a federal government that they believed was not using that money for their protection was something that was greatly upsetting to them. And of course, the other problem was that to be able to pay that tax, you had to be able to go to Philadelphia, which is over 300 miles away, which for most whiskey distillers in this area was not just a hardship, it was a virtual impossibility. And so since there really were no federal buildings or federal agents in this part of the country, it was a real hardship and a real burden for individuals here. But to answer your question, this part of the country was it was rural, it was wilderness. It would have been, the last point where you would be able to get provisions and supplies if you were going west.
By the summer of 1794, the spirit of rebellion had turned into something far more serious. The resistance across western Pennsylvania, rooted in frustration and survival, had begun to boil over into violence. Tax collectors, already viewed as agents of oppression, became targets. In some cases, their homes were burned to the ground. Livestock was taken, personal property destroyed, and in one instance, a U.S. Marshal attempting to serve court summonses was surrounded and attacked. The flashpoint came in late July when a large mob of armed men attacked the home of General John Neville, a prominent tax collector and federal official. The standoff resulted in shots fired, one rebel killed, and homes set ablaze. To President George Washington and his cabinet, this was no longer just a regional protest. It was an open rebellion, a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government. And so, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president put on a uniform and took command of the troops in the field. Washington, along with Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton and a federal force of nearly 13,000 soldiers, marched into western Pennsylvania. Their message was clear. The law would be enforced and the unity of the Republic would be preserved, by force if necessary. It was the largest military action ever taken against American citizens by their own government. Soldiers came from New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania itself. For the people living in South Fayette, the sight of so many armed men approaching from the east was both shocking and sobering. But just as quickly as the rebellion had ignited, it fizzled. Facing overwhelming force and the real possibility of armed conflict with the federal army, most rebels disappeared into the hills. The makeshift militias scattered, some leaders fled, others, fearing execution, surrendered quietly. In South Fayette, as in nearby towns, many simply returned to their farms, silent, wary, and defeated. A few men were arrested and charged with treason, though most were eventually pardoned by Washington in a gesture of reconciliation. No major battles were fought, no widespread violence erupted, but the government's message had been delivered loud and clear. Resistance was tolerated, rebellion was not. For South Fayette's farmers, the end of the rebellion did not bring celebration. It brought a quiet, uneasy peace. Some felt disillusioned with the government that they had once believed in. Others took pride in the fact that they had stood up for themselves, their neighbors, and their way of life. Either way, their role in history had been written. The rebellion collapsed without bloodshed, but it left scars in homes, memories, and in the way citizens viewed their government. The events of 1794 had tested the Constitution and for the first time proved that federal laws could and would be enforced across all states, even the farthest frontier.